On behalf of Alderman Scott and Mayor Curtatone, I want to welcome you to this meeting and thank you for coming. This project, the Conway field renovation, came out of a number of things, one of which I know some of you are familiar with, the fields plan that we had worked out a few years ago on how to try to increase the playing hours for our youth in Somerville. And as part of the process of exploring what can and cannot be done there and what steps are necessary for starting the community process on that, we did some soil testing and some geotechnical investigation, both because there's a wall there that is in need of repair and both because there is soil there that we would, during construction, have to remove from the site.
Recorded or anything?
Yes.
Will we be able to get a recorded hearing of this?
Yes, this meeting will be posted online.
Is it being recorded?
Yes, both in this microphone and that camera.
Thank you.
Sure. So that's where this is all coming from. I want to just talk about a little bit where the meeting has been posted for those of you who found out about it. I think I do not have my list here, but it was posted online. It was put in the social media feed. If any of you follow that, or if you want to stay abreast of what's happening, Facebook, Twitter, it's all on the city's official page. It was also translated into the different languages. It was put in the local newspapers and in a community note, as well as communicated to both, I think, the athletic community and the Board of Aldermen. So we did try to do a pretty comprehensive job of explaining or telling everyone what was happening today. I want to talk a little bit about the format. We have a lot of stuff to talk about today, and some of it is quite technical and quite dense. So I've brought some yellow papers over there and pens. If you could please write down your questions so that we can get through the consultant's presentation. We want to make sure that every question is answered, but it's just much more efficient if we're not having the constant interruptions. We will stay here until all of those questions are answered. So please feel free to take some paper, pass it around. With that, I'm going to introduce you to the consulting team. They are from the Environment, Geotechnical, and Energy Group at Weston and Sampson, and two of them are licensed site professionals. So these are folks that are experts both in what kind of contaminants you could find in an urban environment and what the regulatory framework is for dealing with those contaminants. So that's George Naslas and, let me see if I can get this name right, Prasata Bunya. They're both licensed site professionals. We also have, as part of the team, Marie Ruderman, who is a risk assessor, and she is an expert in knowing what contaminants, what the actual human health issues could be around those urban contaminants. So we thought it very important to have this team here to make sure that your questions and concerns are answered. And they're going to go through what the tests are, what tests were done and what they mean. I also want to mention that this project is normally being managed by my colleague, Arne Franzen, who's the Director of Parks and Open Space. He's not here today because he was away and then got sick. So in the future, when you have questions, you can direct them to him. If you direct them to me, that's fine. I will get them to him. But just so we know, and to let you know that everything is on the website. If you just go to the City of Somerville's website and click on Conway Park, there's a page that's being set up that has both the information that we've released thus far and we'll have this video on it. Are there any original questions before we get to understanding what the team has done?
Can you talk about the history of the site?
So all of that is going to be addressed. They will talk about the history of the site, they will talk about the contaminants, and they will talk about what that means for the cleanup of the site. So again, if we can just let them get through it at the end, we'll absolutely be here until all of the questions are answered. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to George.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. So we'll start a little bit, just an orientation of the site. I know everybody is familiar with Conway Park, but we're going to be talking specifically today about two distinct areas. We're going to be talking about the playground area, which is on the north side that fronts Somerville Avenue, and we're going to be talking about the field area, which is located, obviously the bulk of the area, abuts the ice rink and adjacent to the residence and Allen Court in the background. And this is important because this project began really looking at the retaining wall that's in the south, will be the south east corner of the site. And the project began because the wall was starting to tip over, and the city asked us to come and do it.
That wall's been tipping over for
Cor-
many years.
Yep, I know that.
You just said it was starting to tip over.
The wall is, so we were asked to come in and do a structural evaluation and a geotechnical evaluation of the wall and come up with options to either fix it or replace it. And in those discussions, we talked a little bit about the site history of Conway Park. So Conway Park, as some of you may or may not know, was a former bleachery and dye facility dating back to the 1890s. And it stayed as an industrial commercial complex through the early to mid-30s when the buildings were demolished. And from then on, it was initially a field, an open space area, and then went through a number of renovations, culminating in the park that you see today. As we looked at the wall project, one of the cost drivers when you're dealing with urban sites and potential urban historic fill is the question about what if the fill, the historic fill, is impacted. So we had a discussion with the city about proactively going out and doing some testing in this area for two reasons. One was to evaluate what costs we might have associated with the wall project. But the second reason was we're looking ahead, as Louisa said, that the plan is to do a field renovation down the road as part of the master plan. So we decided that it'd be prudent to do some evaluation of the field conditions, soil conditions, so that we would have an idea moving forward what we might find. And we went into it with our eyes open. We recognized that because of the proximity to Bay State smelting, which was on the other side of the ice rink, that we might have some contaminants that we would need to manage as part of the project. So in the late fall of last year, November time, we did some sampling. We found what I would call typical urban historic fill contaminants. We found some metals, including lead. We found some other compounds, such as a family of compounds called polyaromatic hydrocarbons. They're very common in urban fill. And we found those across the site at varying concentrations, but nothing that jumped out to us as unusual. We had one sample there in the disposal characterization sample, which is a sample that is a composite sample. It's an aggregate of a couple of samples with PCBs, that's polychlorinated biphenyls. PCBs are a different category of contaminant, and it's unusual. It's unusual to find them in a field in this sort of setting. So that raised a question: do we have PCBs, and what about the lead concentrations? Where are they across the site? By this time, it was the end of the season. We were in the winter break. We decided with the city to do an additional evaluation and look at some shallow and deeper samples across the site, and also collect a couple of samples from the playground area, which hadn't really been assessed at that point, just in case. So a couple of weeks ago, we did the sampling pretty much in the gap between the hard frost and the snow, and we were able to get our samples collected. And we found, and we got the data a couple of Fridays ago, that we found we had concentrations of lead that were very similar to what we had seen before, and we also found PCBs in shallow and deeper soils. And that was a surprise, honestly. So at that point, the city, and we discussed the data, and immediately the city made an instant decision that because we are at a very preliminary stage of understanding what the contaminants are, that we would close the playground pending some further sampling, and the field, which has already been closed, would stay closed and locked. And this is important because obviously the concern for parents and from the state's concern as well, and the city's concern is anybody being exposed to these shallow contaminants. And it's important to think about what is shallow versus deep, because for lead and for PCBs, your exposure really is contact. If you don't touch the soil, then you're not being exposed. So really, when we're looking at things that are 3 to 6 feet deep, from an exposure point of view, the risk is very, very, very low. What's more of a concern was, what about the shallow soils? And, you know, we know, obviously, it's been a field for a long time. We know there's a playground. So we went back this week, Monday. We went out and sampled just the top foot. And the point of that was to really understand what might we have across the different finishes of the playground. As you know, you've got a paved area with some swings, you've got a mulched area, and you've got landscaped area. So those are the kind of the three finishes that you have in the playground. And we wanted to make sure that in that top foot, the area that people might be exposed to, that we wanted to know what the contaminants might be. We also went back and did some additional shallow, top foot samples across the park. We went back to some of the locations where we had other data, and we collected a few additional samples from some of the baseball diamond areas as well as the center of the field. So this is this data. The data we got came in last, what are we today? Thursday, last night. We were looking at it this morning. So you are getting a report on what is very preliminary. The other piece to this is back in December, we recognized that because we had detected concentrations, we would need to report the concentrations to the state. And that's a normal process. Whenever there's an assessment done and a reporting threshold is exceeded, the process is there's a reporting deadline to the state, and the reporting deadline was April 12th, but the city proactively have called the state. We've called the state, and we've already reported the contaminants. April 12th is the date it's due to be reported, but we spoke to both EPA and the state this week. Spoke to Steve Johnson, who's section chief in the Northeast region, and we spoke to Kim Tisa from EPA, but it was actually the notification form was uploaded today. So that is a process that is that we are now following. What that means is now this site is regulated under what's called the Massachusetts Contingency Plan. That means there are certain things we need to now do to ensure that we understand the nature and extent of contaminants at the site, we understand the risk, and that we get to a solution where the site is cleaned up to the point that there's no risk. But the other piece to this was, what about the shallow exposure? So that's what we wanted to make sure that, that's why we went out and did the sampling this week. So our preliminary data is basically showing that across in the playground area, let's talk about the playground area, we have very, very low concentrations. We're focusing on PCBs, very, very low concentrations. In fact, most of the data from the playground area was below detection limits. We had 2 samples that were very, very low detections, and Marie, who's here, will talk a little bit about what that data means, the risk. But we basically concluded at this point in time that we have very, very low risk in the playground area. In the field area, we had a variety of concentrations. We had, in one deep sample, we had pretty high concentrations, very high concentration in one sample location at a depth. Sure, right here, B105, a depth of 3 to 6 feet. Yeah, down there, yep. Yep, Somerville Park. And this is the T right-of-way. And we had a couple of samples across the site that are between 1 is a cleanup goal, and 10 parts per million. And then we had 2 points that were around 14. So we've also evaluated risk preliminarily preliminary evaluated risk for the park area to see, well, what does that mean? Does that mean for folks playing in the park that might have been exposed to these points, what does that mean from a risk and safety point of view? So where we are, and Marie's talk about the risk in a minute, but what this means is this site has been reported to the state and is now in a process to move forward to evaluate the nature and extent of contamination and then come up with a plan to address the high areas of contamination and fully evaluate risk across the whole site. But I'm going to just take a pause and then talk about what the data means that we have collected already. So I'll turn it over to Marie.
Okay. Hi, I'm Marie Ruderman. I'm a risk assessor and toxicologist with Weston and Sampson. And when we were evaluating this property, we were looking at the surface soil only. And that's because the areas where people might be exposed were really only surface soil. I also want to let you know that the lead, which George mentioned, was really at background concentrations. It was essentially below urban background that you might see anywhere, in an urban setting such as Somerville. And the concentrations that we detected of lead in surface soil across the entire property did not cause a health concern, which is why we focused on the PCBs when we went back and we collected the 0 to 1. So,
Can everyone hear Marie?
can you guys hear me? All right. So, as George stated, we looked at two different areas. Essentially, we looked at the playground area and we looked at the ball field area. So, when I looked at the data for the playground area, most of the data was essentially at what you would see in background for PCBs with only like 2 samples that were just above what you might think of as background in the playground area. And what I did was I ran a risk assessment, essentially. It's called an imminent hazard evaluation. And when you think about risk and you think about health risks, I want you to think of it in terms of human health risk is equal to exposure times toxicity, okay? And so when I do an imminent hazard evaluation, I select a receptor that might be exposed to the park, and I selected a park visitor, and I assumed enhanced exposure assumptions so that it's protective of anybody who might be at the park. Young children, adults, anybody who might be immunocompromised, essentially I select a very conservative receptor. And some of the assumptions that I assume are that this park visitor will go to the site and be there 3 days a week, 30 weeks per year, and over 5 years. And each day of exposure, they're there for 24 hours. So, if you have a young child that's only there for an hour, that's, really assuming, that they're there for a very long time every year for 5 years, essentially. These are all DEP assumptions that are in the Massachusetts contingency plan. They're default exposure assumptions that are just, kind of over the top, conservative, essentially. I also assume that the receptors may be exposed to soil by ingestion as well as dermal contact. And I assume that they are going to be ingesting 100 milligrams per kilogram of soil on each day of exposure, which is like, it's kind of a small handful, or what you might have under all your fingernails and rubbed up on your hands. And then they're also going to be exposed by dermal contact, so they're going to be exposed on their face, forearms, legs, lower legs, feet, and hands. So on each day of exposure. So as I did this evaluation, and used the average concentration and the max concentration in the playground, the calculated risks for the PCB exposure was well below an acceptable level. So there's no significant risk and no imminent hazard in the playground area. And so I also did the same evaluation for the ballpark area using the surface soil. And the average and the 90th percentile concentration both passed the risk assessment. There's essentially no significant risk and no imminent hazard in this area. However, there were two concentrations of soil that were elevated above an imminent hazard level. Those two that actually George mentioned, that were 14 milligram per kilogram. Yes?
Yeah.
Yep. Which ones were they? They were
104, well, in the official soil, we had one at 104 and one at 111.
right. So we're going to continue to do more evaluation of the surface soil since we have some elevated levels in the ball field. But essentially, there's no imminent hazard associated with exposure to either the ball field or the playground.
Thanks, Marie. So,
Yep.
so what we're trying to do at this point, this is an iterative process. We're not up here saying, we're done, we're finished, thank you very much, we're going to close it out. This is the first step. This is the preliminary data that we're giving to you. This is just the initial step of understanding what we might have there. And it was important to answer those questions of what's in the surface, because that's what people are exposed to. So we feel pretty good about what we've done to date. The next steps are to evaluate in more detail the contaminants across the site. And that means collecting more data, focusing both. We'll probably collect some data in the playground, although given it's a relatively small area, we feel fairly good about what we have already. And we'll be collecting additional samples throughout the ball field area. We'll also be talking to EPA because PCBs are regulated by EPA as well as by Mass DEP. And we'll be coming up with a work plan to ensure that we have done an adequate assessment of that area, and then come with a remediation cleanup plan. We anticipate cleanup would not be done just independently. It's going to be done as part of the fields program in the future. The goal is to renovate these fields. So we anticipate as we get into field design, there'll be a component of cleanup that goes along with it. And that will be the hot spot that I mentioned earlier, that we had a high concentration. Some of these superficial higher concentrations that we know about. And we're going to do additional sampling, so there may be some other areas. It's important to understand, though, so as we remove soil from the so-called hot spots, that allows, that first of all takes away the higher concentrations. But what's very important is the field construction is going to be in such a way that there's going to be no contact either. So we're looking at, at this point in time, we have not come up with a final option. This is very preliminary data that we're talking about with you. But the goal is to start working with whoever the design team is for the fields to make sure that there's no exposure to or no contact with underlying soil, both for folks, for kids playing on the field, for workers that may need to come in and do utility work, for maintenance crews as well. So that's the plan.
So at this point, I'm going to ask Jill, who's the Director of Parks and Open Space, to come up because there may be some questions, and I want to open it up to answer any of your questions. Let's start first with the questions on the data and the testing that was done.
So I don't think it takes a tremendous amount of detective work to figure out where lead could have come from, knowing there was on the spell. But the PCBs, you say you were surprised, and I don't know anything about PCBs. Where might PCBs have come from, and what do they mean?
So PCBs are very common in the electrical industry. They're in transformers and capacitors. They're in electrical equipment. They may have been originated from the smelting, Bay State smelters. So they were located the other side of where the ice rink now, in the parking lot. But it is possible that some of the material that they produced may have been used to fill this area. You find PCBs in rail yards, in oils. They're often associated with oils. The property of PCBs is that they keep electrical equipment cool. So you get these oil-filled transformers, for example, and so it stops the oil from overheating. Where else do we see? Yeah.
In their carcinogenic, or is that the concern?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So you've assessed the soil surfaces. So
Yep.
I know that you're not in the business of telling our city what to do to cap this off, but would your interest be in finding out what's below the soil surface?
Sure.
And would capping it make it inaccessible?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So we actually do have some deeper samples, 3 to 6, in that initial assessment, the second assessment that we did, or really the initial assessment looking across the site. We did some samples in 0 to 3 feet, and then some from 3 to 6. We have a couple from 6 to 9. What we see across most of this site is approximately anywhere from 10 to 12 feet of fill. So it's a pretty substantial amount. And as you know, down here on Allen Court, the retaining wall's pretty high up, actually. So this is the low spot in this corner. And then below that, you get into native material, which, for all intents and purposes, is clean. So we actually do have to, as part of our characterization, to get through a closure, we do have to know enough about both shallow and deeper soil.
So would you still have to continue the process?
Yeah, there's definitely we're just at the beginning of the assessment, but the point of this was to, if people were worried about the park and being out there, we wanted to let people know the first thing we did was, one, close it, but then assess all that superficial soil, which is the direct contact.
It's a very long range.
Oh, this is a process. This is a process, yeah, for sure. And capping, sorry, I'll come to you in a second, sir. Capping is an option. The field could be the cap. The way you construct the field could be the cap, and that's quite common. You might put some sort of geotextile barrier down and then build the field up so everybody knows that below this orange marker you've got impacted soil. But it all boils down to risk. So we think it's a combination of removing some of the hot spots and then doing some sort of capping or cover scenario. I just want to add, just so everyone understands, that these contaminants are different to what you might find, say, at a dry cleaner or at a gas station. These aren't the types of contaminants that get into building spaces and volatilize, typically. They're more associated with the soil. They tend to stick to the soil. So that's why understanding and limiting contact is really important, or eliminating contact. Yes, sir.
Just trying to get some timeline here. Weston Sampson, you guys got involved in Conway Park because of the failing wall, and then it turned out you ended up doing the testing on sample. And if so, when did you guys start getting involved in Conway Park? What time period?
It was really last fall we started talking about doing an evaluation of the wall. We had to wait till the programming was done, because we knew we'd be coming out there with equipment. We had a backhoe, we had a drill rig, so we didn't want to be doing that while the fields were in use.
So to your knowledge, the city did nothing with Conway Park for you guys coming out?
With respect to testing,
The testing or the wall?
well, they knew about the wall, and
Did you do anything?
they brought us in to look at the wall.
6 months.
In November. Yeah, we were looking at November. We got our data December, actually we wrote the report December, that we had a meeting to discuss it. And that's when we, in December, recognized that we needed to do some sampling across, additional sampling across the site. Yeah. Yes.
When, I have a couple of questions. So when this field was done and when the playground was done, was there any process to remediate? Why wasn't the soil tested then and why wasn't it found then?
I don't have an answer for you. I don't know. We did look back at historical photographs. So there were buildings there in the early beginning of the 30s. By 34 or so, or 38, they're gone. We think the park was dedicated in 34, but I think it was more of an open field at that time. So what I don't have is any information about, is it the same elevation it is now, or was that subsequent? We know the Bay State Smelters was closed in the mid to late 90s, 97 I think was the date. But what I don't know is, in that 60-year period, how were these fields used? I mean, I know there were basketball courts at some point in time, so we're doing a little bit of research to try and understand timing of when this fill may have been brought onto the site. Or it may have come from somewhere else completely too. We don't
So when
know.
I did just a quick search on the park, whoever the designer is actually still has, maybe you found this too, they still have Conway Park as a showpiece, or I can't remember the landscape architect. So there's actually a picture of Conway Park, the playground and stuff.
Yeah,
So-
you're talking about the playground piece rather
Well,
than.
it was kind of unclear. It looked
Yeah.
as though some field work, so I just, given, my guess would be that when that work was done, there should have been tests.
So the field and the playground were refurbished in 2000, between 2000 and 2004, and we are actively looking through those files to find out what was done, was topsoil brought in, removed, were there testing, was testing done at that time, so we are researching that history still. And it's Wallace Floyd is the, they might want to change over, it's been 14 years. Yeah.
It seems pretty significant to me in that there was it wasn't that long ago, and I can't imagine that there wasn't some processing of testing the soil. I mean, all those trees got planted, I mean, it's a pretty major work. Then the other piece was, I didn't know, a lot of work has happened recently on the railroad. They had to redo the crossing. I didn't know if there was thoughts about contamination coming from the railroad cars coming down the corridor.
Meaning that could have been the origin of the contamination, or that recent projects happened?
I think recent projects would particularly happen, and I just know that railroad corridors are often sites for, I don't know about the PCBs, but I know lead and arsenic and stuff. So it seems like, given the proximity with wind and,
Give it a go. Answering your question, it's speculation. The corridor's a little lower down, so that was one.
yeah.
We do see PCBs associated with rail yards, but that's usually in maintenance areas where oils from the trains are drifting down and they do change-outs and things. One of the things you do see along railroad corridors is lead and arsenic from the herbicides that they put down. We didn't see much arsenic, right? So we've sort of concluded that it may not be a source, but yeah, we're scratching our heads too, because PCBs was started, what, in 1924%? So it was
24, 25.
Yeah. So they began then, but the heyday was quite a bit later. So we feel it's unlikely that a park that was initially constructed, or a field in the 30s, I don't know. I don't know whether something that was invented in the 20s would have made it to the park by the 30s. It was probably some iteration at a later date, but we don't know.
But you're thinking it got imported there, like in the topsoil? You don't know anything?
Yeah, I do. I don't think it was a release to the ground at the site. I think it's mixed in with the fill that was brought in at some point in time. I mean,
It was a lot cheaper to do it that
It
way.
was a lot, and I know a guy.
Well,
It's not uncommon.
it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon. We've worked together 25 years. I know when I first worked at Weston and Sampson, you were working on Martin Park in Boston. It's not uncommon. A lot of these urban settings, the only open space was, areas that were demolished and cleared, if you like. It's just not uncommon.
There also there wasn't the same understanding or the
Right.
same regulatory framework.
Any other questions?
What kind of timeline are we looking at? I know you said it's a process, it's gonna take a while before a plan is formulated. What is your gut tell you? Obviously, it's subject to change based on what the results say and what the city wants to do.
Well, we've been scrambling for about a week, running out there, getting data, checking the lab, making sure it's real data. So I just feel I'm taking a breath tonight. But the goal now is to, we've had an initial look at the risk, is to develop a sampling program that will probably implement. I don't want to speak for the city because they have to fund it, but I think we're talking spring to get a better understanding of what we have. And then we need to meet with EPA and go over the data with EPA, their PCB coordinator, and discuss the data, because the PCB is the risk driver. If we have enough data and the risk pans out and we can come up with a plan, it will be integrated into the field design, which originally we were thinking towards the end of the year, right, with construction starting next year. But I don't want to speak for the city because I don't know about the field process.
Don't worry about it, it won't be on time, it's supposed to be done by now.
So-
Field plans that have been done in 17.
So, this was really a first step to try to ascertain. We did geotechnical testing both here and on the Healy School, which we did call for in the plan, and this is not what we were expecting, so there is some time involved both in the reporting and the regulatory obligations that we have, and then in figuring out, because of this, we have to figure out what we can and cannot do and how we can and cannot do it. So it's going to take some time. It does create a burden on field hours, absolutely, but we have to deal with this now.
I think it's I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think it's a little more than a burden on. That's an understatement. There are no fields to have a burden on. And so therefore, 3 years ago, I was in a meeting with Joe where he said, we're starting remediation on Conway Park. We're going to start working on Conway Park. And that didn't happen. And we just heard from this gentleman's mouth, who I'm very respectful of your opinion and the work you've done, and I'm very glad you're here. But we were told 3 years ago that this was going to start. And now I'm just finding out from him that it just happened this past fall. Okay, we already lost Lincoln Park, and now we're going to lose this. And we have, I'm the president of Somerville Youth Soccer. I have 1,000 children that play soccer in Somerville. And you know where they're going to play next fall? In another town, okay? So, or we just don't have a program anymore. So I'm not putting it on you necessarily, but that statement that you just made is a ridiculous understatement of the problem that we have, okay?
But probably our position is with Arn, he's not here to defend himself, but we're wondering why the city didn't do anything for 2.5 years.
Yeah.
It's the city for developers, not for people to live there. But can I ask a question about the retaining wall? Because I live right there.
Sure.
What is your connection to the retaining wall versus this contamination? I'm not,
Me personally, well, my company was asked to.
I don't
look
care
at-
about you personally.
Okay,
I'm looking at,
my company was asked to look at the options for the wall.
meaning, how does that relate to the PCBs?
So you've obviously familiar with the wall. How do you fix it? Do you push it back up and try and tie it back? Do you pull it down and build a new wall? If so, what kind of wall? So there are a couple of options, and that requires, what's interesting about that wall, it's not really tied into anything. There's no foundation to it. So it's not really a surprise it rotated. But we didn't know that till we dug behind it and had a look to see where the footings are. And then if the plan is to build a new wall there, you've got to pull soil behind and putting footings. So when you do that, there's going to be excess soil that's generated. It just always happens in a construction project. So the reason we were brought in was not just to think about the structural and geotech options for the wall, but was to understand the quality of the soil behind the wall that you're going to be managing. And that's where really this came from was, well, we know we're going to be doing field rehab, so we need to look across the site as well. Going in with our eyes open, recognizing.
You didn't think that there was contamination at the wall, did you?
We didn't know.
You didn't know.
And actually, right up against the wall, it is not really contaminated. The soil right behind the wall is cleaner fill, but it's as you move away from it, and whatever you need to do to put a new wall in requires removal of soil.
So may I just ask, were you hired just to do the wall or to look at the entire expanse of the field?
No, that project, when it came in and when we were discussing it with Anne and the scope and what we were asked to do, it was, we were discussing that at some point there's going to be a field project.
Yeah.
So let's look at the wall while we're out there with a drill rig and a backhoe. Let's do some of the other testing to get a feel. So it was trying to be efficient.
It was doing two.
Yeah, kill two birds
Okay,
with one stone.
as long as we know that.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Is there any chance that the playground will open up separate from the field?
So right now, they're going to be doing more testing. We really have closed it off in an abundance of caution, even though it isn't an imminent hazard. And once their testing is done and the report, then we have to decide, is a portion of it safe to be open? Should it remain closed? That's a decision we'll be making in the upcoming days.
Initially, there wasn't any signage by the field and the playground. Has that changed? And if not, will it?
I don't know what signs are on there. It sounds like there are no signs on there.
Says 311 temporary closure.
Is there now? Okay, great.
It's just a little handwritten thing. I don't think it's sufficient.
Yeah, there's no signs, it's just a fence.
It's just the fence, the playground's fenced.
There was a series of signs that were put around one day, and they quickly blew away.
Okay.
And then somebody came back and put a metal sign that's handwritten. So there's one sign at sort of where you enter the playground by something that's
Okay.
right.
So one thing I think is very important in this process, because it will be a process, is the communication. And I want to make sure that everyone has very clearly written their name on the email list, because it's very difficult for folks with bad penmanship to get those in. So we want to make sure that that goes out. We also want to make sure that you know that this information is on the website. There's been a page created. We will update it as we have. We know this is a very difficult situation. You know, as having worked on the Fields Master Plan, I'm acutely aware of the difficulty this makes. It also is just a difficulty for folks who want to use the open space. And we don't have a lot of open space in Somerville, so we're really aware of how this makes people worry about health and safety. We wanted to make sure that they were here to answer those questions. We're also acutely aware of what it means in terms of our open space. So please do get your name on the emailing list and check the website. Was there another question? Did I? Yeah.
Like a timeline of when we'll have the timeline? If that makes any sense.
So this is difficult, but George, jump in with me. There's a number of reporting and reports that have to come out of this, and then reporting to EPA and DEP.
Yeah. So the city's been very proactive on this. I mean, in a normal situation where you have contamination and report to the state, the next deliverables a year from there. And that's when the report goes in.
The next, I'm sorry, what did you say? I missed what you
Give
said.
false information.
No,
No, no.
incorrect.
PCBs are a required timeline, which is in your report, I think it's 120 days.
No.
Unless you notify, yeah.
No,
If you close the park, you get the 120 or 30 days.
Okay, let's talk about the data and let's talk about the obligation of, what the obligation of the city is and what the city's doing. When there's a reportable to the state, there's an initial reporting of what that initial data was. The next report is actually due to the state 1 year. That's an initial characterization. City has already gone out and done an initial characterization. And it was important that the city did this. They were being very proactive, and I support that 100%. So the fact that there's data out there already is actually quite unusual. We will be discussing with the city on, next steps. So timeline for timeline, I think the goal is to get with the city in the next month and figure out what we need to do next.
What about us other than emails? Is there any other meeting? I'm going to encourage people here to sign up to do a public involvement plan, which is under the mass contingency plan. And it means that it requires them to have meetings with us. It's the only way you really get the facts. And DEP has a woman there named Karen Stromberg who makes sure that they follow the rules and enforces it. So you need 10 people to sign on to that to get it going.
So we have no problem having public meetings. In fact, we want you to be informed. We want to be as transparent as possible, which is why we would like to use the email lists and the various communication methods that I talked about early on to make sure you're aware of those public meetings. We'd also like your help in communicating to other folks, letting them know that this is on the website so people can watch this meeting in its entirety, get the facts from the consultants that we asked to come in today, and let people know. If there are questions, you can email Arn, you can email me, you can contact the city, and we will do our best to get those answered. Again, if there are any other questions that folks have tonight, I would encourage you please to ask them, because we have consultants here who, and we will stay, if people want to ask questions individually, we will be here for a bit longer. Yes.
In terms of this timeline again, so you talked about, I wasn't clear with the 120 days, like you have a requirement to get it in within 120 days, but it's already in now.
Yeah.
So now you handed it over to the EPA, and is it in the EPA's hands, and the EPA takes control, or the city has control, or DEP, who has control?
So the way it works in this state, on any site, put this aside, is once a site is reported, it goes into what's called the Massachusetts Contingency Plan, MCP. Mass DEP has jurisdiction over that, but the management of the response actions is done by a licensed site professional. That's how this state works. They've licensed individuals like myself, like Presenter, to manage cleanup. And this is the licensing started in '93, so it's a very well-established program. But on something like this, where there's a little higher profile, where there might be PCBs, we've already reached out to DEP. We've already spoken to DEP to let them know what's going on. With PCBs in particular, over a certain threshold, EPA also gets involved. And so normally on a site, if it was a gas station site, we wouldn't be involving EPA at all. We'd just be dealing with Mass DEP, and the licensed site professional would manage the whole process. Because we have PCBs, because EPA is involved, we kind of have two people to report to as the LSP, and two sets of regulations to meet. So if your concern is there oversight from a state regulator or a federal regulator, the answer is yes.
Being bogged down in bureaucracy.
Great question. So if EPA is not involved, we think they will be, but we've
will be.
Yeah. But we've already spoken to the person that gets involved. That will be the piece that slows the process down with respect to getting agreement on what the sampling plan should be, and then evaluating that data. That could be something that bogs us down.
So will my 10-year-old ever play on this field again?
Yes. Wow. Ever?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. I play old boys soccer.
Basically looking at like 2020 before the use of this field is available again, at the
I
earliest.
think you're jumping the gun, John.
It's
You're definitely
way-
jumping the gun.
I think you're being optimistic.
I mean, at the earliest, is what you're saying.
So I will say, with a normal parks project, it usually takes about 3 years from start to finish.
They just did one in Everett in less than a year.
Right, but they probably didn't, right, they probably didn't
All right, so
have,
we'll go 2 years. I don't know. Oh, we just gotta relay the info to all the parents that when we're going to other cities to play,
Which
Why?
I'm going to be doing.
right.
For 2.5
So the
years,
alternative
it
is-
sounds like we're going to be doing that.
go to other cities, because we don't have any more fields in Somerville.
Can I just speak?
Yes, please.
So you guys all know that we have a humongous field shortage in Somerville, and we are diligently working with our surrounding communities to help us with this. It's something that I'm working on, you know, a lot. I totally understand the frustration. I hear it. I meet with you guys, and we are doing, literally, I'm doing the best we can to accommodate displacement, best we can with surrounding cities, whether that be, you know, how can we use our other fields such as Trum? How can we use, you know, Medford? How can we use, you know, Mackinac? Those kind of things. So we hear you, I hear you, and we are diligently trying to find some solutions in the interim.
Can I ask one thing of you, Joe? In this process, we're an immigrant city, okay? And we have a lot of parents that don't speak English. And when we don't have local fields for our children to play on, and we're asking kids to join our organizations and they have to play outside of our cities, I would like a commitment from the Recs Department or from the city that says, you know, we understand that our kids can't play in Somerville. We have thousands of children that should be playing in Somerville. We are willing to find transportation for them to play in Medford, to play in Malden, to play in Everett, to play in Chelsea, wherever they have to play this sport. There has to be some commitment from the city because my organization is already stretched to the limits and we can't do any outreach whatsoever. You're going to just, with the loss of this field and the loss of the other fields that we have in Somerville, you know, we're so hamstrung, we've lost everybody. I mean, we will lose the entire immigrant community in Somerville. And if we really believe in our effort to be a sanctuary city, we need to be fully cognizant, and the city needs to be fully aware of that and to commit themselves to this obligation. Does that make sense?
Oh, it's transient. It doesn't seem unreasonable.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions? This is not a feel-good meeting. We all acknowledge that, and it is a problem that we have been working on for a long time, and it's taking a long time to solve. We all acknowledge that. Yes.
Sort of new to this, I'm not very familiar with Field's plan or what's been going on more holistically. Is there an intention to survey other field spaces in the city or other, you know, playground spaces or public spaces to see, you know, it seems like it was done ahead of schedule because they were doing the wall, but, you know, is that, where can I find more information?
About the Fields plan and the Fields crisis that we have?
Yeah, or you know, does how contaminant testing features?
So normally, as a practice, when we know that we have to remove soils based on land use history and the regulations that then come with it, we test soils, or when we're acquiring a property. So those are usually the situations in which we test the soil to know, is there something there. In terms of the fields and the shortage, we have a grave shortage of hours for children to play on, youth to play on. And we don't have a lot of fields, we don't have enough fields, and we are 4 square miles with 80,000 people. It's very hard to get new fields. There was a long community conversation about that problem where we did a lot of data analysis and then tried to come up with a series of if we did this and that,
some of our largest fields we do not own, DCR does. So we have a real problem and limited abilities to fix that problem. So over time, we're trying to, Conway is a workhorse of the field system, and we're not hoping that this happened, but now that we have this, now that we have knowledge of this, we have to address it.
But the impetus for testing is based on site history.
Land use history and
Yeah.
removal of soil. So for example, or acquisition, when we built Symphony Park, we tested that park. We're working on the Art Farm, which was a waste transfer station. We tested that site. So yes, understanding, and which is difficult because much of our city had industrial. Yes.
I have a question, especially for you, Jill, as well. So there are a number of adult sports leagues that use our fields as well. I just wanted to know what the policy was about that in terms of how we decide when adults can play. Is there any priority for you?
Absolutely, there's a field permitting policy online, and there's a policy, so.
So there are a lot of other fields that are used pretty regularly by adults.
So for example, so youth soccer, because of their greatest need, they have all the fields available till 9:30, with the exception of the Dilboy Stadium complex, which is a regional facility that I have to manage regionally for the state. So there's some limitations as far as with the Dilboy complex, how I need to allow
What are the
time.
limitations?
Well, I need to allow time for other people from the region, because we manage that for the state. We have a contract with the states, we manage the Dilboy complex, so it has to be a regional facility. So Somerville has some priority uses on that, but it can't be.
Well, I mean, could we get an exception to that in some way,
Well,
given our
I
situation?
think it's definitely worth a conversation with DCR, but to your question about adult uses, adults at most of our fields, they don't get on the fields till after 8 o'clock. At Trump, at Dilboy Complex, that's different because it's a regional facility. So again, youth soccer has every available time available to them.
I'm actually
on our
not talking
city
about
fields.
soccer, honestly, these are baseball fields also. Just so you don't forget.
I'm saying for that kind of need. So when we look at, say, Trump, for example, again, the high school's there till 6, we have the youth there till 8:30, and they have priority timing and priority scheduling for the time that they need for Trump Field. Conway, Little League, when it was open and available, the Little League had Conway till 8 p.m. They had
There are
Conway.
only two or three baseball fields in the city.
Again, they had Hodgkins, which was a youth-only field. So.
I'm asking about the fields that we don't have access to. Is there some way to
Can you give me an example?
Right, sure, Dilboy in the afternoons and weekends.
So again, there are youth do use that. The high school has Dilboy.
Schedule, it doesn't look that way.
Well, the youth soccer has it from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. permitted, scheduled. It's on the calendar.
Only on Saturday.
On Saturday. And so that's what they needed and requested, and that's what they have.
Only on Saturdays and only in the spring.
In the Little League field?
No, only
The stadium, we're talking about the fields.
We don't have auxiliary.
So, for example, Little League has, this spring, they have Dilboy all throughout the building. Dilboy B, which the high school has it, and then we permit what people requested. So Little League has Dilboy now, because of the situation with Conway. They have 5 days a week and they split it with youth softball on Saturdays. And so on Sundays, yeah. So now Dilboy A, there's other leagues that play, some youth, some adult, but it's only permitted after I've gone through the youth permit. So once youth had said, this is what I need.
But
then I
we
put that in.
didn't find out that Conway was closed until 2 weeks ago, so how could we have asked for, how did we even have to know that we needed to permit?
So when I say we, what particular?
I'm talking about baseball, I'm sorry.
Baseball.
Okay, these are baseball, yes, Little League, I'm sorry.
Okay, so, and I've addressed that. I've given Little League
We have
Dilboy B. I've talked with Dan.
That's what we had that last year.
No, you had it 2 days a week last year. You had Mondays and Wednesdays. So this year, because of this situation, you have it 6 days. That's what was based on what you had at Conway. I transferred as much as I could to Dilboy to give you everything you needed at Dilboy B.
We have 2 fields at Conway.
Exactly. So
we're still short.
You're absolutely, Sean, you're absolutely right. So I reached out to DCR to help accommodate, so what can we do for FOSS? Okay, and hoping that our youth organizations can come together and work out a plan and secure FOSS, okay? So, and you know, my greatest hope is that we can come together and figure out this puzzle for this particular spring. So, and unfortunately, the high school was like, you know what, I'm gonna step up and I'm gonna give Little League what they need from like 3 to 5:30, what we can have. The other piece of that, you know, DCR has those permits, and they're gonna divvy those out. So we have time available from that 3 to 5:30 time that I'm waiting to hear back from Dan. We're looking to see what you guys are gonna be doing for Medford and seeing what we can do. So we have, you know, literally have just reached out and gone up and beyond to try and make sure we can help solve the situation. So did I answer your question, or?
Not really, but I guess I asked if the adult, I mean, I can say it's okay.
I think what you asked is youth given a priority.
Correct.
And Jill's answer is yes.
But I'm not really seeing it. Is that right?
So I think that might be a conversation that you can have. I know, you know, when we did the data for the Fields Master Plan, we did know that something like 93% of the permitting is for youth. And I know that we've always prioritized youth, but the youth athletes. It sounds like there's other conversations about permitting that you can have online. Yes.
For people who live on the park, there's a lot of wind and dust that flies. Are you recommending that we keep our windows closed?
So there was no imminent hazard, no significant risk associated with exposure to the surface soil. So I would assume that it's very unlikely that folks that are abutters would have any risk as well.
Well, thanks for coming out, and thank you again for having the patience to listen to all this very dense data. We do ask for your help in kind of spreading the word and letting people know where they can get the information and where our communication lists are. People can sign up online to be on the email list and can email me or Arn, who will be back after he gets over his flu. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
I mean,